Hey everybody, Mr. Yockers here. I'm going to have a quick Yock Talk, going over a few things for the Unit 5 exam. So I have here the Unit 5 review study guide. So it might be a good idea to get that out. And as I mentioned, in class, having the Unit 5 packet's also going to be helpful. And then also going through the slideshow, that would definitely be helpful. I really think that if you go through all of the quizzes, if you've taken the small 3-question quizzes, and if you've taken the progress checks, the multiple choice progress checks, you should be in really good shape. And then for those of you that have completed the free response questions, that has given you kind of some specific example case study kind of situations where you can apply some of the knowledge that you should have picked up with your readings, discussions, and the things that we went over in class. So just jumping down real quickly into the key points for each of our topics. Do remember the different ecosystem services that we went over. Provisioning services, I think that's pretty obvious with the products, the lumber, the fish, the meats that we get, from gray or range lands, or from the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, those kind of things. But also remember, regulating services are extremely important. So regulating services like pollination, pest control. If you remember when we went over IPM, integrated pest management, having spiders, ladybird beetles, praying mantis, those predatory arthropods, insects that are out there, or even birds. Birds would be a great pest control that we have provided by Mother Nature as well. So having all those things available, that helps regulate what we consider to be pests in the environment. Also, erosion control, flood control, recharging groundwater, all those different things. Those are also some of our regulating services that we depend upon for some of the things that Mother Nature provides. Okay, so just keep all those services, recreational services, sense of identity, those would be the cultural things. So just remember the different services. Tragedy of the Commons, I don't think we have to worry about that too much. We've gone over plenty of examples there, so I think you should be in pretty good shape. Just remember, how to avoid the tragedy of the commons. Privatizing land could help for better management of land, but obviously you get into issues of equity and fairness if land is privatized. For forestry, having maybe limits to the amount of timber that can be cut down, the methods that are used, whether it's clear cutting or it's the selective cutting, some of those different forestry practices that we talked about in class. And for fisheries, the limits, maybe the times of year that fisher people are allowed to go out and harvest. So different things that can restrict, kind of control the amount that is being harvested or extracted from public resources, okay, or our public lands or public waters. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind. In different ways perhaps we could do that. Let's see, clear cutting, some of the obviously we talked about efficiency. One of the big things about the green revolution and kind of our industrial agriculture is the efficiency that we have in planting, raising, harvesting, processing monocultures, whether that be wheat, soybeans, corn, but also timber. So, we talked about tree plantations, how they have that monoculture. So it's a pretty efficient process for trying to, get the maximum benefit. But that's something that is used a lot more nowadays on private lands. When we get into public lands, there's a little bit more concern about that multiple use that we mentioned in class. And so we hate to have areas completely kind of, treeless areas. And so that's where you see a lot more selective cutting kind of taking place nowadays. All right. So I think all the things there, the points, you should be somewhat familiar with all of those. If you remember the video that we watched, and that's in the slideshow about forestry practices in southeastern Oklahoma, They're concerned about the SMZ, the stream management zone, making sure there's little siltation, erosion that's running sediments down into those streams, and also having the trees, the larger vegetation near the streams, which will shade the streams and maintain a cooler temperature for the for the different animals that are living in that system. Okay. All right, green revolution. Big thing about green revolution is we talked about some of the kind of the monoculture parts to that, but also dependence upon fossil fuels for machinery, for the production of fertilizer. Fixing that nitrogen out of the atmosphere is a very energy intensive process. Also the production of pesticides. And so all of those are kind of key components. And then we start to raise crops perhaps on areas where they didn't have as much or enough precipitation for certain crops. Maybe the soils were some slightly marginal, so they weren't kind of suited for some of the crops that we were growing. But irrigation is another part of the green revolution that's very, very heavily employed in a lot of places, and that can lead to some problems that we'll see later on. Okay. And then there was also, with the green revolution, the development of different hybrids for our crops, that artificial selection, and then also GMOs, genetically modified organisms, to try to perhaps develop crops that were more drought resistant, pest resistant, more productive, so they have a higher yield per acre. So all of those things are, different components of the green revolution. So you got the positives, obviously, more food, greater productivity, but then we also started to realize we had some negatives associated with that as well. All right, so those are some things to keep in mind. With regards to agriculture, we talked about pesticide use. Let's see, the pesticides, yeah, so I think that's later on, pest control methods as well. But just remember when we went over Rachel Carson in the video, it did mention some of the things like the pesticide treadmill that we know, we see that taking place around us, whether it's plants developing resistance to things like Roundup, or you have different insect pests developing resistances to some of the insecticides that are used as well. Long-term impacts of industrial agriculture and soil. So be thinking about, soil erosion, soil nutrient depletion, maybe salinization that's taking place, which is a result of irrigation using groundwater and our surface water. So remember, anytime we have groundwater or surface water being used for crops, they will have a mineral content. And so whenever they evaporate, they would leave behind those minerals in the soil. So that could eventually lead to some issues with soil chemistry and the ability of plants to take up nutrients. Okay. Let's see, irrigation methods. Of the 4 methods that the College Board had for us in the packet, be sure that you know the hierarchy, or the kind of the progression from the least efficient to the most efficient. So you need to be familiar with those. Salinization, we already talked about that. Waterlogging, if you look at the slideshow, there's a good slide in there about having that saturated soil for an extended period of time, and how that can affect some plants that don't like that, which a lot of our grain crops are like that. And then also we talked about the diversion of surface water or groundwater for irrigation. The RLC is the classic example of that. So we went over that a little bit in class, but also out in the western Oklahoma, panhandle of Texas up through western Kansas, western Nebraska, a little bit of eastern Colorado as well. We have the Ogallala Aquifer, and there is, a drawdown in water levels there, the groundwater levels there, which is leading to some difficulties now. So in those areas where precipitation amounts typically aren't high enough for some of the grain crops like wheat and corn, we're using a lot of groundwater to allow those crops to be grown out there. And that's leading into some groundwater issues, where groundwater doesn't have the chance to recharge. Surface water from rainfall doesn't have the ability to keep up with what's being extracted for irrigation. Pest control methods, yeah, we already went over some of that. Remember, one thing we mentioned was the type of pesticide that would be most ideal, just using some general categories. And so we would like pesticides to be non-persistent and to be selective, so that they're targeting a certain species. If you remember the ones that we don't really like, DDT is the classic case study that we went over, we saw in the Rachel Carson video. That's a pesticide that is very persistent, lasts a long period of time. In the slideshow, we went over kind of the life expectancy of some of those persistent pesticides, and we saw DDT can be around for decades in soil after it's been applied. And then also it's a broad spectrum, so it's not kind of specific for certain pest type, but it has damaging effects for insects, for mammals, for fish, for birds. It has impacts on all of those. Another thing to keep in mind with the pesticides was the bioaccumulation in biomass as they start to increase in concentrations as you go up to trophic levels, and that would be our biomagnification. Okay, and also we talked a little bit about integrated pest management. So if you remember the video we watched, the bug guy, he goes through and talks about some of the things that you can do to kind of control pests with this integrated pest management philosophy for your garden at home. But we talked about how that can be applied to our large scale operations as well. Okay, for meat production, so this is our talking about terrestrial animals here. We have our CAFOs, our concentrated animal feeding operations. And so just kind of be thinking about, the impacts that could develop whenever you have a lot of animals very close together, have very, very high densities of animals and remember what goes in, if all these animals, we're feeding all these animals in a place for them to put on weight to prepare them for market. What goes in also has to come out. And so there's a lot of organic waste that's associated with CAFOs, and we will talk about that more later on as far as our water pollution issues, nutrient enrichment of water. And so if you have a CAFO, you have to be very concerned about runoff from those places. And so those typically have sewage lagoons, we'll call them sewage lagoons to keep it simple, to try to collect a lot of the organic waste and hold it so that it's not running into streams that are nearby or having an opportunity to affect groundwater. Let's see, so yeah, just be kind of thinking about that. One thing about the rangelands, if you have cattle out at pasture or the rangelands, one of the impacts we're worried about is overgrazing. And I grabbed a few things from the slideshow to put in, talking about our CAFOs, the pros and cons. Remember, we always have to kind of try to balance the pros and cons. And so this slide does a nice job of kind of giving us the highlights from each of those. Okay. Overfishing, we talked about this a little bit in class. We watched the videos about cod off of Norway and then off Newfoundland, and talked a little bit about that. One thing about aquaculture, be sure you take a look at that in the slideshow. Obviously, there's benefits to that because you're putting less pressure on your wild populations, but you have to remember that the vast majority of fish that you raise, they're predators. And so they have to, in order to put on the mass and to be able to grow and proper development, they need a high amount of protein. So typically what you see in a lot of these fish farms, aquaculture operations, is the fact that they have to use fish meal. Typically they have to catch maybe wild fish, they have to process that, make it into fish meal that then they feed to these fish in these operations. And so there still is some stress on wild populations. They're So that's continues to be an issue. And then you have the organic waste. If you have all the fish concentrated in a given area in pens, there is a lot of organic waste that is released that's kind of concentrated, kind of like a concentrated animal feeding operation that on a land, our terrestrial animals. Same thing can happen with aquaculture. And then of course you always have the possibility that these organisms could escape and get out and cause problems with the wild populations, maybe carry diseases to the wild populations. Both the CAFOs and in these aquaculture situations, you have to be concerned about disease outbreaks because you have very, very high population densities. And if you remember, the spread of disease is density dependent. And that's one issue we've had in our CAFOs is the use of antibiotics to try to control the outbreak of disease. There's a lot more regulations now on the use of antibiotics in these kind of situations, trying to eliminate some of our problems with bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And so there's much stricter rules on the use of antibiotics now than we had, just a few years ago. Okay, for mining, I think this is one that we need to take just a little bit more time looking at here. And so as far as the different types of mining, most of us, when we think of a mine, we think of below ground mining, but you also have surface mining. Surface mining is going to be cheaper because the deposits of whatever mineral or maybe coal, for example, that we're trying to get to is near the surface. So it doesn't cost as much to reach the resource that you're looking at. But if you're surface mining, there's a lot of damage to habitat in that situation. So habitat value in those areas really declines. And so we've had legislation to try, an attempt to return or restore areas that have undergone surface mining to their original or as close to original as possible, the habitat value that they had prior to the extraction of the resources. So there's some legislation associated with that you need to be familiar with. So the different techniques, strip mining, any of the mining that you have on the surface, one thing that you're doing is you're getting rid of the overburden. And so the overburden is the material that's between you, it's the material between you and the resource that you want to extract. And so you have to get the overburden off, get that someplace else. If the resource you're looking for is too deep for it to be economically kind of worthwhile to remove the overburden, then that's where you might go into the subsurface mining techniques. Okay, so those are the different types of surface mining that you might see. There was a diagram that we had in the book I put in the slideshow, kind of showing the different mining possibilities. You can see the subsurface. Typically, the surface footprint for subsurface is fairly small, except for the tailings that you might have. The tailings are the byproducts, the different materials that come out that don't have a really high concentration of the resource that you're looking for, whether that's metal or coal or some other mineral that you're looking for. And so that's discarded on the surface. But there will still be some heavy metals present in those tailings that you put on the surface, and that can lead to issues with water quality, the runoff from that. So that's one thing that you need to be aware of as far as the impacts. And this little table from our textbook does a nice job of kind of going through. We know that we're getting the resource, so there's obviously the provisioning service that's being provided. But also you have the negatives that are associated with it. So this table here goes through some of those. These are the two big laws that you need to be familiar with associated with mining. One, the Mining Law of 1872, that basically opened up a lot of possibilities for people for extracting resources. So that was to encourage a lot of expansion and development in the western part of the United States. And then you have the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. So you're trying to reclaim, you're trying to restore the habitat values for that particular area, the ecosystem services that were present prior to the mining. So we're talking about surface mining. So those are two important laws that related to the mining, excuse me, especially the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. Okay. Urbanization, if you go through the slideshow, I think that's pretty obvious there. One of the things that it kind of focused on was runoff in urban situations. And so just be aware that you need to be familiar with that. And that's further on down. So we'll talk about that. We went over ecological footprints. So we talked about that quite a bit, knowing the difference between developed countries and developing countries. So, we know as human population increases, the effect is going to continue to, we're going to continue to see pressure on the services that are being provided by Mother Earth. And so that's kind of the dilemma there, and that leads us into sustainability. So trying to do things more sustainably. So as the population continues to grow, our use of resources isn't going to continue to grow as well. We have to somehow stabilize that. And that's where the idea of sustainability comes in. Okay. Methods of reducing urban runoff. And so, here in the Tulsa area, I think most of us, we see around us the kind of development taking place. And typically when you see that development, we have to have more parking lots. Just remember that the roof of a house, the roof of a building, is also not allowing rainwater to reach the soil, where that footprint of the building or the footprint of the parking lot or the street is. And so that water will then run off. And so that's part of the increased runoff, is that footprint of parking lots, roofs, whatever it happens to be. And so that allows water to move from an area more quickly, which could lead into flooding. It also reduces groundwater recharge, which we talked about a little bit. We mentioned the Ogallala Aquifer. And so it reduces the ability of water over those areas, those urban areas, to penetrate down into the ground. Okay. So there were just some ways that perhaps you could reduce runoff. And I like some of the questions, the responses that some of you had for that was pretty good in the free response questions. Integrated pest management, as we said, we looked at that earlier. So just remember the bug guys video and some of the things that he mentioned in that. Okay. Sustainable agriculture, using methods that are not the monocultures. So using situations where you might be able, like agroforestry, for example, is where you might be able to combine forestry practices with growing crops in those situations. And another thing that we see quite a bit is areas where we have a tree plantation. If the canopy is somewhat open and you get some light down to the ground, where you have your herbaceous growth, your grasses and your forbs growing, you can also graze animals. So there's different, multiple uses that we can do in some situations for increasing productivity on certain lands. Instead of restricting it just to one use, we can have multiple uses taking place there for our agricultural productivity. Okay. Aquaculture, we already talked about that a little bit. So, so we mentioned that up there kind of with CAFOs and all that, but there are some of the pros and cons, obviously. Yeah, that high year-round productivity, that's a big thing. So that's something that's very, very important. And sustainable forestry, we mentioned that earlier. So, just remember, take a look at your clear cutting, your selective cutting. And so those practices that are in the slideshow, be sure you're taking a look at those. And as always, we're looking at the pros and the cons. We're doing our best to maximize the different services from the ecosystems around us for the benefit of humans. But we have to remember that those systems, in order for them to function properly, we have to do things sustainably, right? So that's the big thing, looking at how to balance the extraction of resources so that they can replenish and renew and be available for future generations. Okay. And then I added in, if I have any more than this, there was one slide here that I really liked, and I put this in the slideshow as well, but this is just showing two of our big public land resources, forest and rangelands, and the way that we kind of manage those and different things that we get from those. And so this is a a good kind of flow chart showing us some of those relationships. Okay, so as I mentioned before, just looking over things here, you should be in pretty good shape, but please do take those progress checks, especially the multiple choice progress checks, and then all of those 3 question quizzes, and then the free response questions give you an opportunity to put some of that factual knowledge kind of into practice as you're proposing, solutions for different problems and all that. All right. Okay, so I think that's it as far as our little YockTock. So best of luck studying, and yeah, there's going to be 32 questions on the test, right? So only 32 questions. Okay, all right.